Hello, and thanks for joining me here for this week's episode of Storytime. Today's story comes from my short story collection, Peripheral Visions and Other Stories, and it's called The Accident. The Accident. When the telephone rang for the fourth time in a row, Margaret frowned in impatience. She had so looked forward to an afternoon of quiet while Megan played at Billy's house. But the interruptions usually caused by one small 5-year-old had been replaced by those of the telephone. The insistent ringing continued as she slid one of the filled cookie sheets from the oven, heat flushing her pale face. It didn't stop until Margaret lifted the receiver and wedged it against her cheek, all the while struggling to remove the chocolate chip cookies, Megan's favorite, from the pan. "Hello," she said impatiently, as one cookie crumbled between the rough thrust of the spatula. "Yes, this is Margaret Adams." The voice on the other end spoke briefly, but it was enough to still her busy hands. She answered, "Yes, right away," and carefully set the phone back down. It wasn't until the smell of burning chocolate invaded the kitchen that Margaret began again to move, slowly, stiffly, as though a painful eternity had passed since the telephone call. She didn't cry. Not when she slipped on her jacket and found Megan's mittens still in her left pocket. Nor when she had to wheel Megan's tricycle out from behind the car. How many times had she told her daughter to park it alongside the wall? And she still didn't cry. Not even when the harried doctor in the busy emergency room used words like unfortunate and unavoidable. "The police think he couldn't stop in time," he said, leaning tiredly against the wall. There were so many victims yet to see. Weekends were always full of accidents. Margaret's hands crumpled the red mittens into a ball and then smoothed them out again. Not enough time, she thought. Not even for my daughter? "It wasn't his fault," he continued, as though it made a difference. Margaret nodded, but wondered whose fault it had been. Megan's, because she didn't stop to look before running out into the street? Or was it Margaret's fault, after all, for allowing Megan to play at someone else's house, for not warning her enough about traffic hazards, for being safe at home baking cookies while her daughter died? "I should have made her wear her mittens," holding them out for the doctor to see. "Her skin gets so chapped." He frowned briefly, thinking to himself that she shouldn't be alone, that shock does strange things to people. Perhaps some medication. "I'll take you to her." But she continued as though he hadn't spoken at all. "I bought them because they matched her coat. She looks so pretty all dressed in red." This way, and not ungently, he took her arm, leading her to the cubicle where Megan lay. She looked like she was sleeping, Margaret thought in surprise. Except for the bruised side of her face and the lack of color in her cheeks, she might be sleeping. Even now, if Margaret shook her just a bit, Megan might awaken, might open her eyes, and— "Nurse," the doctor said softly, indicating with a nod of his head Margaret's presence, and then he was gone. "She needs a haircut," Margaret said to the white uniformed woman. "I wanted to take her this afternoon, but she wanted to play at Billy's house." And was that why it happened? She asked herself. Because I looked forward to an afternoon of quiet? So we settled on tomorrow for the hair, stroking back the 2 long curls from the pale forehead. And instead I baked her favorite cookies. I was also going to read that new book from the library, she remembered. When Megan's home, she interrupts me so often I can never read a story straight through. The nurse reached out to touch Margaret's arm, but she rejected the gesture of sympathy continuing in the same toneless voice. I wonder where Billy's mother is, all the while still running her fingers through the pale golden strands. I would think she'd be here to tell me what happened. She leaned forward to gently straighten the sheet over the narrow shoulders. She's waiting in the hall, the nurse answered, knowing all the while that it would be better if the mother cried, screamed, anything to let the feeling escape. Thank you, Margaret said, and with one last look, she slipped past the nurse in search of the woman who was to have watched over Megan. That's the beginning of the accident, and as you can guess, it is a sad story, probably a heartrending story. It's one of those stories that came to me born out of my own fear of losing someone I love to an accident, to an unexpected event. You know, it's one thing when a person grows old and infirm, and gradually you watch them get closer and closer to the time when you have to give them the final goodbye. It's quite another when a person is taken from you unexpectedly, your child, your spouse, a brother or a sister, when you didn't have time to say everything you wanted to say or whisper that last I love you. Those were, and I'm sure I'm like most people, those were my biggest fears, that I would not have that chance. And so far, at least with my parents, I've been fortunate. I've been there when they've passed. I've had plenty of opportunity to spend time with them. But, you know, I wrote The Accident long before my parents were what one would consider elderly. And so it was born in some way out of my fear of losing them, losing my kids unexpectedly. And it's a story about processing, experiencing, being angry at whoever did this to you, whatever made this happen. But it's also, in a way, a healing story, because I have to write stories that end with some kind of a healing or resolution or the possibility of getting through it. I can't write a story where, even if it doesn't turn out happily ever after, it still has to have some element of closure and comfort. So even though perhaps the beginning of the accident makes you think, I can't bear to read that, that's going to be too painful, let me reassure you that by the time you get to the end of the accident, at least according to the people who have read the story, you may find it to be a good thing to have read. Sometimes we need to read about something sad that ends up having some kind of a positive outcome to make us stop and think about our own lives and perhaps what we should be doing even now. So that is today's story time. As I said, The Accident is from Peripheral Visions and Other Stories. And I hope you have, maybe enjoyed isn't the right word. I hope the story has touched you, and I hope that you have an opportunity to read it in full and get to the end and hopefully think a little bit about your life and the people in your life. Thanks so much, and I'll be back again next week with another story time. Bye-bye.